everyone. This is update for November 14, 2022, day 264 of the war and of the date update. So I'm going to spend more time today on this strategic general topics as situation on the front line is fairly stable, meaning there is fighting, but it's sort of more like a World War One type of fighting there. So let's actually start with one topic is UN Assembly passed resolution on Russian reparations to Ukraine. This is the result of those voting. So in general, the way it's sort of there's more and more clear split. As you can see, the developed world or the West, that those are countries who voted in favor of Russian reparations. Then obviously there is a group of sort of against it, and there's no even point discussing it, with exception that China is in that group, but that should not be a surprise for anyone who is watching this channel. The most interesting actually part is those abstention, right? So you can see this in general, as you can see, this was passed in quite narrow, majority, right? So we have 87 versus 94. So the world is pretty divided in general. That's what you can take away from all of this. And as I said, the most interesting part is abstention. And what you will observe that most of the developing world is essentially against it. And actually, I want to highlight actually two groups there. So the first group is, we're just going to look at, there's this kind of like a big sort of elephants, right? Like Brazil is essentially quietly against it, right? This is who is, Russia, China, and Iran are relying on. They need all of this support. So first, Brazil, as I said, then where is it? India is another one, right? Indonesia is another big country. So as you can see, those countries that really, even though you have formally 94 countries, but if you really look at it from economic perspective, from the number of people and everything and resources, you may see that this abstention plus against might be actually more than the countries that are in favor. So this is one part, just from the elephants, right? But then let's actually look from the countries that provide energy to the West, and I'm talking about the Persian Gulf. What is their position? So you see, like Bahrain is basically against it, then United Arab Emirates against it, Saudi Arabia against it, then who else left? I think Qatar, and I don't see Qatar here. But in any ways, like for example, Oman against it, right? So you can see very clearly that countries in the Persian and Iraq also essentially against it. So again, all of those suppliers of energy are essentially quietly like they have position against the position of the West. And this is an obvious result of those energy policies in the West itself. So that's why you see Chinese president coming to Saudi Arabia end of December, because he's hopeful that he's gonna have a good shot at convincing Saudi Arabia even sort of be even more at odds with the West, right? So, and ensure supply of oil in case of hostilities. So that's a situation. That's why I just want to highlight that this whole voting is really essentially showing division in the world, and two opposing group, and then like one huge silent group that essentially sort of silently supporting this alliance of Russia, China, and Iran essentially. So that's just update on this sort of more and more clear division of the world in this into these groups. And you can say that, okay, some of these countries simply want to stay away out of this coming conflict, which is very reasonable and logical approach. If there you have nothing to gain, why to lose anything? So that's also very sort of reasonable strategy. Nobody's saying that this is wrong, uh, but we can just sort of have very very rough assessment of the division of the interest of different countries in this world, where they stand from their sort of economic interest. Now let's discuss a little bit also Russia. Russian head of it's called it's SVR in Russia, which is um, external intelligence service. That's sort of literal translation, but this is basically equivalent of the U.S. CIA. Narishkin, who is also uh, basically like a close ally of Russian president, essentially like, you know, he's part of inner close circle of those who really make decisions in Russia. And let's say if something happens with Russian president, he would be one of those who will replace him, essentially. So he met with the head of CIA, Burns, in Turkey for negotiation purposes. Uh, it's unclear. So there is formal sort of explanation about, not, to prevent nuclear exchange of nuclear strikes and all of that. That's obviously nobody's gonna do it. So the real topics that were discussed are unknown. So we'll probably find out eventually later. There will be some leaks, or we probably will see from the actions what's really happening. But it's even more interesting that right after that negotiation, he flew to Iran for obviously another round of negotiations there, to kind of like share with Russian ally, what they achieved essentially, right? So you can see this whole alliance between China, Iran, and Russia is like real, and they have real sort of interest and ties that kind of puts them together, because otherwise this is just sort of very sort of unrelated countries in many ways. But as I said, this alliance is real and sort of gaining momentum and strength. Um, then, obviously, the most sort of, I would say, awaited news was the meeting of the Chinese president and US president at G20 meeting. Um, as as a summary, I think the best way to describe it is both parties exchanged their conflicting views. They stated their conflicting views to each other, uh, and what's going to happen is there is no sort of clear, how would say, conclusion from that meeting. Uh, Probably we can just say that they met, but there is no any real breakthrough. Even though U.S. president stated that Chinese invasion of Taiwan is avoidable and so on, that's just sort of more like a hopeful thinking than reality. Let's put this way. Uh, Chinese president really stated his position very much, actually, it's in diplomatic way, but in a very clear way, is he wants West to start dialogue with Russia and sort of stop exporting democracies around the world. And so they don't sort of disturb life of authoritarian regimes around the world. And the other thing that he wanted is uh, uh, removal of this unilateral sanctions that US enacted on technology transfer to China. So we can even like, so there's kind of like this kind of creates objective sort of yardstick that we can then check and see if those sanctions on export of semiconductor manufacturing equipment to China are removed by the US, then there is breakthrough. There is agreement in exchange for this technology transfer. For now, China is not going to attack Taiwan. If that's if that happens, then we all know that this is where it's all going, and this is basically, and I would qualify this. This really means that, in a way, U.S. and West is desperate enough to give this technology to buy a couple more years of time. Let's say 2, 3. I don't. Nobody knows for sure how many more years of time. Let's say between 2 and 4 years of time before inevitable will happen anyways. So that's just what could be happening, but we'll find out from the news. If this gates of technology transfer to China from the West open up again, then that's the deal. If not, then there is really nothing. It's basically nothing, as I say, nothing burger essentially out of this meeting. Um, so um, and then just to kind of like sort of go highlight what's really happening on the ground. There are, in other news, U.S. is building 5 military installations in Philippines, right? And then China is building military base in Cambodia. So basically, both sides are kind of like preparing future battlefield for all of this. Not to mention that during the conversation between Chinese president and U.S. president, 6 Chinese war airplanes flew into Taiwanese airspace, basically, just to show that this is gonna inevitable and it's gonna happen. It's just a question, sort of when, really. And actually, by the way, there is very big hope in China that they will be able to sort of, how to say, conquer, or whatever you call it, Taiwan in sort of peaceful way through political system by base, because Taiwan is somewhat divided. It's not like that the entire country clearly against uniting. Well, I didn't say uniting, but becoming part of China. There is part of the population who supports that, and so China is hopeful that that part of the population will be able to vote into power party that will sort of go the path of Taiwan becoming part of China. So that would be the best sort of win for China, and that's what they sort of probably hopeful for, because that would be like sort of your sort of traditional Sun Tzu art of war approach. It doesn't look that this is actually going to happen, but from Chinese perspective, it's worth trying. Um, and then in other news, and just kind of like explain how myopic some of the West large businesses are, is example of BMW. So BMW just announced that it's going to invest 1.4 billion, I think euros or dollars at this point. It's essentially the same, into accumulator manufacturing facility in China. Um, you know, it's just so they are so deaf that this is just amazing. Just that's all that's possible to say. And then actually, in other news, actually, what happened, I think yesterday, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang, in his speech in Cambodia, he actually condemned Russian nuclear threats. So you can see, kind of like, looks like it's kind of contradictory to uh, what sort of main line of China is, and the reason it contradicts because this Chinese Premier Li Keqiang is sort of one of those holdouts from the faction that wants sort of peaceful let's say, conquer of the world through trade means. If you remember, for those who viewed that, I explained that during this last Communist Party meeting, the Chinese president's faction won, where they won sort of forceful resolution of the into the world domination. But then there is there is a wing that wants to do the same thing, but achieve it in a peaceful way through basically trade wars. Well, and I'm not saying the wars in a meaning in a literal way. What I mean by that is that you know, what I say trade war is when there is deindustrialization of the world is happening, and all of the industrial manufacturing facilities are moving to China. But to be fair, it's not China's fault. It's fault of the rest of the world that creates unbearable conditions for entrepreneurs and manufacturers, so they have to move to China. That creates much better conditions for them. But nevertheless, they compete and they know what they do. I mean, Chinese, and they achieve, they achieved essentially in many ways miracle over past since, let's say, early 90s. Let's put this way. Now let's actually switch a little bit away from China. Let's look at what's going on in Russia a little bit. Economy wise, and things there are not sort of going well. As I mentioned this before, Russia started with very pristine, excellent state budget and generally state finances, with the situation with the foreign currency reserves. Everything like looked perfect, like the best sort of example for the world, let's put this way. Now things deteriorated completely, and things are sort of, now it's actually at the bottom of the world in terms of the how the state of the affairs of the state finances and general situation. And that's a really reflection of the devastating situation with the Russian economy. So, for example, in October, Russian state budget revenues fell by 20%. And this is for non-energy sort of exports, right? So we're removing those sort of, export of, crude oil and all of that, that still brings quite a bit of revenue. If you remove all of those energy exports and just look everything non-energy, this kind of gives you good proxy for the situation in the Russian economy itself, right? So as you can see, there's less of added value being generated. And I mentioned this starting from end of April and May, that industrial production or industrial facilities are getting devastated and closed in Russia. And so now there's a lag effect, obviously, because there is huge inertia in the economy, in the business. So now it's really starting to catch up to the Russian, and we can see the sort of reflection in the fall of the revenues of the Russian budget. So just give you sort of, to confirm this at more sort of like low level example. So if we look at at Moscow office space market, right? Moscow is basically essentially, it's almost like you can say Russia, right? Because it's a very centralized country, so everything is super centralized in Moscow. So it's almost like there is no life outside of Moscow. There are other couple cities that are still significant, like Saint Petersburg, Yekaterinburg. Those probably a couple more I can mention, but generally, I don't have like sort of handy number, but let's say Moscow is where, I don't know, 50, 60, 70% of sort of, well, not really value add is generated, but where majority of the Russian companies are registered for tax purposes, so they pay taxes essentially in Moscow. So this is again also very crazy approach where you super centralize everything, and basically headquarters are all in Moscow, where real assets and actually assets that really truly produce value add, they somewhere in somewhere far away, uh, and actually those areas they don't get pretty much anything out of the value add that's being generated because the taxes are being paid in Moscow, in the center of in the center essentially. So this is kind of like basically you siphoning everything out of the country and accumulating in one sort of extremely large city, because Moscow is I think 18 pushing 20 million people. So this is the reason why the city has grown so much, is because everybody understands this sort of logic in Russia. So they move to Moscow because that's the best way to economically prosper and survive. So, but going back to Moscow, and what I'll try to say is that the amount of the office space that will be sort of new office space that will be commissioned into service will be around 300,000, basically 240 to 300,000 square meters. And typical average before the war was 760,000 square meters. So this is why it's important, and why I explain everything about Moscow, because this is like where the money is, right? So everything is super concentrated, and even the place where the money is, you see like it fell by almost like what, 2.5 times, right? So this again, this is kind of like small uh, piece that supports that whole idea of the economic devastation that's happening in Russia. Now let's actually touch a little bit one other topic that's plugging and destroying also West from within, and specifically inflation. So there is inflation information that came out of Finland, and this is just example of how bad things are. So the food inflation just in October was 15.7%. In many items went, like food items, and we're talking about food, right? So many food items went up between 30 to 50%. For example, flour went up 46%. The reason I'm talking about the food, because it's something that everybody has to spend money on. It's unavoidable, and it really hits people's budgets and incomes in very direct way. And as you can see, numbers are pretty bad. US also had inflation numbers that came out, and they were 7.7% on Friday, and market got super excited, thinking that US Federal Reserve is gonna stop increasing hiking interest rates, and probably will even go back to sort of zero interest rates. This is probably unlikely to happen. First of all, for one simple reason, that the interest rates at, let's say, 4% are not even norm. They are on the lower end of the norm where they're supposed to be. And in order to contain inflation, let's say in the US, these interest rates have to be at least 4%, and probably they're going to go higher. So, so in a way, those who were like hoping for the reversal of this tightening essentially don't realize that probably times of 0% interest rates are gone for good. As long as there is problem with energy supply, as long as there is a war on conventional energy, this world of this sort of, call it normal interest rates, is new norm, and it will persist. Yes, there will be probably sort of reactions under, because this will affect sort of economic activity. It's already affecting. Starting to affect US in major way, because you can look, and there's a lot of large corporation announcing layoffs, starting to announce layoffs. So this probably will hit more towards the end of the year, early next year economy. The housing market is essentially frozen. So it's going to hit the economy, and the hope is that it will force the head of the Fed and they will sort of basically go back down to zero. Uh, the problem with all of that is if they try to do it, inflation will shoot over 10% in the US, and that will really uh, undermine all financial stability, social stability, literally, in the country, which already is not in a good sort of shape. Let's put this way. So that's for the general topics. Now let's actually switch finally to Ukraine and let's see what's going on there. So in terms of the energy distribution system, still alive, sort of semi-dead, but so far it's still it hasn't collapsed. Let's put this way. But uh, the cold weather is coming, and by cold weather I mean like minus 15 degrees Celsius up to 20 in next probably like 5-10 days. There is forecast for that's coming, and that will be the real test. Because if this system fails, there will be cascading effect um, on this apartment buildings, which are all centralized. So they're basically getting, heat not from within the building, but it's supplied through the like basically like facilities that produce that heat and cogenerate, and then it also another product is electricity. And so if that stops, all of that water stops, and under such temperatures, it will blow up all of the heating system in these apartment buildings, and they will become basically uninhabitable, and for the until spring comes, and then it's going to be very expensive repairs there. So yeah, so this is real like danger and possibility. There will be like people may uh, just huge exodus from this relatively large cities. So that's a real danger. This is real possibility. So remains to be and as I said, the system will be put to test pretty soon. Now let's actually switch to the walk through the battlefield. We're gonna do it in a clockwise fashion as we always do, starting from the very north and then going south and then a little bit towards west. So exchange along the state border of artillery fire is still low, a little bit higher, but still on very much on the lower end. Now let's move to North Luhansk front line, and things here are somewhat similar with some variation. Now mostly Russian troops are counterattacking here with direction towards Kupiansk, and then Ukrainian troops are attacking still here in this area of Makivka, trying to basically get to the river and cross across the river. Both sides are unsuccessful, and essentially status quo remains here. Now let's move to North Donbass front line, and things here also very similar, even though it was much quieter in terms of Wagner mercenaries. They either regrouping or whatever it is, but there was relatively quiet day on the entire front line here. The only place was this Bilohorivka here, which is actually not in the area of responsibility of Wagner mercenaries. This is where the area, as you can see, it starts here right around Verkhnyo-Kamensk and then goes all the way south to Bakhmut, and then it kind of like ends here a little bit south of Kurdyumivka. So the only other place where they attacked was Kurdyumivka. Then Ukrainian troops are desperately attempting to push Wagner mercenaries back because, as you can see, all of this penetration in Ukrainian defense, they don't bode well, and really means that sooner than later the Russian troops will basically outflank Bakhmut and essentially will force the hand of Ukrainian command to sort of surrender the city. So basically Ukrainian troops attempted counteroffensive that didn't go anywhere so far. And as I said, uh, there is no strategic answer so far within the Soviet army to the Wagner mercenaries. They always gonna win over the Soviet army, and no matter how motivated Soviet army is, because the problem is even people motivated, they then disempowered by the Soviet system. So essentially, you back to basic of almost like you can say you have unmotivated people, which is sort of in a way not true, but the effect of this disempowerment is such that essentially makes those people unmotivated. Now let's move to the central Donbass front line. And things here are also somewhat quieter, as you can see, just attacks out of this Pisky salient. So Russian troops continuing their attempts to essentially also outflank Avdiivka and force withdrawal of Ukrainian troops from Avdiivka. And then, futile attacks in Marinka. One other update, so it does look like Russian troops finally squeezed Ukrainian troops out of Pavlivka completely. But as I mentioned this before many times, it was just attack, sort of like there's this kind of like road to nowhere. So this was attack to nowhere. So yes, Russian troops managed to capture Pavlivka, but the problem is that Vugledar is about 30 meters above the level of Pavlivka. So essentially, it's almost suicidal to attack Vugledar, and as I said before, you have very clear view of sight, and you don't even need any sort of correction tools such as Orlan 10, which Ukraine still doesn't have, and still doesn't have organizational system. That's a more important to have that, to take advantage of any other UAVs. It has some, but very few. But in this case, you don't even need any of those because you have a very clear view of sight, and you just basically, shell those Russian troops in Pavlivka to death, essentially. So kind of turning it into mid grinder. So again, this is, as I said, road to nowhere for the Russian troops. Nevertheless, for whatever reason, Russian commanders decided to do that. Then, in terms of situation on the Zaporizhya front line, things are so far quiet. There are no news of the new troops being redeployed to this area by both sides, by Ukrainian and Russian side. But I'm pretty sure that we're gonna see that pretty soon. Let's put it this way. But so far, Ukrainian side is sort of celebrating victory, and Russian troops are also sort of digging in and building defensive positions. That's it for today. Thanks for watching, and until tomorrow. Bye bye.